I think it's time we have a little talk about woke versus socially conscious, because there is a huge difference between the two. I've seen many people who should honestly know better call something woke for having a female lead, or will discuss racial issues that's going to come out. Now, I understand why they think that. Hollywood has done everything it can for the past 5 or so years to hammer this mindset into so many people's heads. And I've been guilty of this too in the past as well. But, if we're being honest, it's a stupid mindset to have. You sound like those anus breathers that will complain about the Northman because it doesn't have any black people in it, just in the opposite direction. Woke from the perspective of the company producing said piece of media is purely performative. While the creator may care about the issues they're raising, the company sure as hell doesn't. They're just simply trying to earn brownie points. Disney says they care about representation and they don't stand for racism. Meanwhile, they'll shrink Finn on the Chinese TFA poster, or cover Chadwick Boseman's face on the Black Panther Chinese poster. They appease racists for the sake of making a bigger profit. From a story perspective, woke lacks any and all nuance to the issues it raises. For example, if a story takes place during Jim Crow in the South, you can bet that almost every white person will not just be racist, but comically so. Racism will be their defining characteristic. They will only ever talk about how they hate black people. None of the racists will ever be willing to change their minds. And while there will perhaps be a few non-racist white people, they will not matter in the plot. All the black people will be innocent victims and not a single one will harbor any racial hatred of their own, or said hatred will be seen as reasonable, as well as any violent actions. Everything would just be transparent. A socially conscious story would add levels of nuance to this. While a lot of white people would be racist just because of the era and location, they would all be varying levels of racist. You would have your KKK types and others who take it to the extreme, but the majority of racists would be more passive and dismissive towards black people, but wouldn't be too overt about it and would even oppose the violence. Some might even be willing to change their mind. There would also be white people who oppose the discrimination of black people who have immense relevance to the plot. Even the very racist people would have more nuance. Racism isn't the only thing they care about. Perhaps even they could change their mind as the story goes on. All forms of violence and racism on both sides is condemned, as all it does is set progress back. A socially conscious story would add levels of nuance to this. While a lot of white people would be racist just because of the era and location, they would all be varying levels of racist. You would have your KKK types and others who take it to the extreme, but the majority of racists would be more passive and dismissive towards black people, but wouldn't be too overt about it and would even oppose the violence. Some might even be willing to change their mind. There would also be white people who oppose the discrimination of black people who have immense relevance to the plot. Even the very racist people would have more nuance. Racism isn't the only thing they care about. Perhaps even they could change their mind as the story goes on. All forms of violence and racism on both sides is condemned, as all it does is set progress back. Now, this example is pretty easy for obvious reasons. Let's try one that's a tad more difficult, like Prey, since that seems to be a popular topic on this channel recently. Let's use the synopsis I gave in my first video on it. Woke would be as I explained. Key would be better than all the men around her in consistently putting them down. She would always be right and have little if any flaws. The gender roles would be considered always bad, but only the gender roles of the women and not the men. Their gender roles don't matter because they're men. She kills the Yaojua better than any of the male protagonists in the previous films, and her choice was 100% the right one. Something that would be socially conscious would show that gender roles themselves are not inherently bad, especially that of a society that is at best barely out of the Stone Age. The reason that women aren't hunters or warriors is because of the obvious biological differences and the ability to have kids, which even in more advanced societies at the time was considered valuable, but that wouldn't make them lesser. The roles of the men would be shown to be harsher. They're out there in the wilderness hunting and getting injured by animals or the terrain. She would initially think that despite the dangers, it's a life she wants. But her encounter with the Yaojua would potentially change that. She would beat it, but comes so close to death she's potentially crippled or suffers a major injury that stays with her. She could either stay a hunter if the injury isn't that bad, but have a new appreciation for what the women do, while understanding that the life of the men is incredibly important and not the romanticized life she thought it would be. Or realize that the life she didn't want is just as fulfilling, especially if she has children of her own who she could teach the skills she picked up, potentially starting a new generation that would try and have the best of both worlds. You know, nuance. These examples have been simplified a bit, I'll admit, but they are ones that have been done before, especially the woke ones. I do hope I've explained them well enough for other people, as I have a tendency to give explanations that make sense to me, but not to other people. If there are any faults with them, please let me know in the comments. If you want to see more content, be sure to subscribe and like the video. Also, I'll be cutting down the frequency of these smaller videos as I work on my bigger project of finishing Ruby Volume 8. So look out for that, and I'll see you next time.